She had 3 days before the bank sent a man to collect what her late husband had left her, not savings, not land, but debt. The town of Caldwell already believed she had forged the deed. She had not. This is not a story about a woman who needed rescuing. It is a story about a woman who told the truth when no one would hear it, and the one man who decided the town's verdict was none of his concern. The ink on the eviction notice was still damp when Nora Vance walked out of the Caldwell County Clerk's office into the flat October light. She did not cry. She had learned, in 31 years of living and 2 of widowhood, that tears in public were a kind of confession, and she had nothing left to confess. Welcome to Dusty Vows, where the women are underestimated and the men are slow to understand what is standing right in front of them. Subscribe now so you never miss a story. And stay, because this one starts with a woman alone in a courthouse and ends somewhere neither of them expected. The paper in her hand stated plainly that the deed to the homestead she had worked alongside her husband for 4 years had been filed under a signature the court now deemed fraudulent. Hers. Her name. Her hand. Called a forgery by a man who had never once looked at her during the proceeding, not when she entered, not when she spoke, not when the ruling was read aloud and the room shifted the way rooms do when a verdict lands on someone who cannot afford to fight it. She had worn her best dress, dark wool, mended at the left cuff, pressed the night before with a flat iron she had to reheat twice because the stove kept losing its draw. She had worn it because she believed, even then, that dignity was a kind of argument. She had been wrong about that, too. Elias Croft stood on the steps of the Mercantile across the road and watched her come out. He was not a man who watched people, as a rule. He had 40 head of cattle to move before the first frost, a fence line down on the eastern quarter, and a banknote that was 2 months patient but would not stay that way. He had no business watching a widow in a gray dress stand alone on a courthouse step with a paper that clearly carried bad news. He watched anyway. She folded the notice twice, tucked it into her coat pocket with the precision of a woman who had been folding bad news neatly for a long time. Then she looked up, and her eyes found his across the road the way a person's eyes find the one face that isn't pretending not to see them. He looked away first. She crossed the road. He did not expect that. "You're Elias Croft," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am. I'm told you need a bookkeeper, someone who can read a contract and knows which end of a ledger to start from." She looked at him without apology. Her chin was level. Her voice carried no plea in it. "I'm told your last man left in August, and your accounts are 4 months behind." "Who told you that?" "Agnes Pruitt at the boarding house. She tells everyone." He almost said something that would have ended the conversation before it began. He could feel the words forming, the dismissal, the polite redirect, the version of no that wouldn't require him to look directly at the steadiness in her face. He had used it on ranch hands twice her size, and men who'd come out to the property with proposals he hadn't asked for. He didn't use it on her. "I need someone who can start tomorrow," he said instead. "I can start today." He studied her for a moment, the worn cuff, the straight back, the way she held herself like a woman who had decided that being diminished was something that happened to her, not something she participated in. He had no frame for it. He stepped off the Mercantile step and walked to where his wagon stood hitched at the post. "Wagon leaves in 10 minutes, he said. She was already walking. The ride out to the Croft Ranch took 40 minutes on the wagon road. Neither of them spoke for the first 20. The prairie spread out flat and gray-brown on both sides, the grass bent low by a wind that carried the cold edge of the season turning. Nora kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the land the way a woman watches something she is calculating the worth of, not with longing, but with the steady appraisal of someone who has learned to read terrain. "They say you forged the deed," Elias said. He said it the way a man tests ice, 1 foot forward, listening for the crack. "They do." "Did you?" "No." She turned to look at him. "My husband signed it drunk and dated it wrong. I corrected the date in my own hand before filing. The clerk who accepted it 2 years ago is now the clerk who is calling it fraudulent. The same clerk who recently became brother-in-law to the man who wants the land." She paused. "That is the whole of it." He said nothing. The wagon hit a rut and he steadied the reins without looking at them. "You can believe it or not," she said. doesn't change what I can do with your ledgers." A crow crossed the road ahead of them. The wind shifted and brought with it the smell of turned earth from a field to the north that someone had broken too late in the season. Elias watched the road. Nora watched the field. Neither of them said anything else for the remaining 20 minutes, and the silence was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was, she had found, a reasonable beginning. The ranch house was weathered pine and determination. Someone had tried to paint the porch rail once. The ghost of white still clung to the wood in patches and given up at the halfway point, which told her something about the man who lived here. The kitchen smelled of iron and cold ash, a stove that hadn't been properly banked, a floor that hadn't seen a broom in the better part of 2 weeks, and on the table, a stack of papers 3 inches deep that made Nora go very still the moment she saw them. She set down her bag. She pulled off her gloves and laid them across the bag. She sat. Elias stood in the doorway watching her pick up the first page the way a doctor picks up a chart, with focus, not judgment. No wince at the disorder, no pause to take stock. She simply began. "You owe Halverson Grain $11 from August," she said without looking up. "But this receipt from September shows you overpaid by 14. They owe you $3 and a written acknowledgement of the credit." "I didn't know that." "I know you didn't." She turned the page. "You also have a lien notation here that I believe is a clerical fabrication. Has anyone at the bank spoken to you directly about the Morrison parcel?" He came fully into the kitchen then, the floorboards registering each step. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "Morrison's been trying to fold my east fence line into his property for 2 seasons. He filed something in August. I couldn't make sense of the language." Nora looked at the lien notice with the focus of someone doing arithmetic in her head. She held it for 45 seconds exactly. Then she set it down on the left side of the table, apart from everything else, with the precision of a woman sorting a problem she already knows how to solve. "This is not a legal lien," she said. "This is a letter dressed to look like one. It has no clerk's seal, no case number, no filing date that corresponds to any active docket I can identify. It is a pressure document sent to frighten you into inaction or a bad settlement. Morrison sent it, hoping you wouldn't look closely enough to know the difference." She looked up at him for the first time since sitting down. "Do you have a lawyer?" "Can't afford one. You don't need one for this. You need a letter written in the correct legal register, sent to the correct jurisdictional office. I can write it." She said it plainly, not as an offer, as a fact. Elias Croft looked at the woman across his kitchen table, the woman the town had called a forger, a fraud, a widow who couldn't be trusted with her own name, and felt something shift in the back of his chest. Not warmth, not yet. Something quieter and more structural. The particular feeling of watching a person do exactly what they were made to do, doing it without an audience, without asking for acknowledgement, without any performance of competence at all. "He didn't say any of this," he said. "The spare room's off the hall. Stove works." She nodded once, pulled the next page toward her. He sat across from her for another 10 minutes before he remembered he had cattle to move, and left her to it. This is Dusty Vows, where stories like hers live. Women who knew more than the room gave them credit for. Men who were just beginning to understand what that meant. If you want the next story the moment it arrives, subscribe now. Then, back to the ranch. 3 days passed. Nora worked at the kitchen table from first light until the lamps needed lighting. She sorted 4 months of Elias Croft's financial life into an order that made sense, not just numerically, but legally. She built 2 separate filing systems, one for current obligations and one for disputed claims, labeling each document in a hand so consistent it looked nearly printed. She found 2 more pressure documents from Morrison buried in an unsorted pile from July, both using similar language, both lacking clerk seals, both designed to produce the same effect: confusion, delay, resignation. She wrote responses to each, precise, formal, and devastating in their specificity. She had spent 2 years watching her husband's lawyer protect interests that were never hers, speaking a language she was not supposed to understand. She had understood it anyway. She had learned by listening from hallways, reading documents left on desks, asking questions of clerks who underestimated what she would do with the answers. Elias moved through the days around her. He came in at midday for the food she had quietly taken to leaving on the back of the stove. Nothing elaborate, dried beans and cornbread, once a piece of salt pork she'd found in the cold cellar still wrapped and serviceable. He ate standing. He nodded. He went back out. On the fourth morning he came in at dawn before the sun had cleared the horizon and found her already at the table, her hair still in its nighttime braid, a lamp burning low, the Morrison file open before her and annotated in a margin hand so precise it looked like typeset. He stood in the doorway in his coat and watched her without her knowing. She pressed 2 fingers to a line of text, tracing a date, said without looking up, "There's coffee on the stove. I made it 20 minutes ago." He had not made a sound. He had no idea how she'd heard him. He crossed to the stove, poured a cup, stood at the far end of the kitchen and drank it, watching her work, and did not speak because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying more accurately. On the 5th day, a woman named Ruth Delaney came down the road in a buckboard, the kind of woman who moved through Caldwell the way weather moved, arriving before she announced herself and leaving a changed atmosphere behind. She tied up at the post, climbed the porch steps without hesitation, and knocked twice before Nora reached the door. "Nora Vance," she said, looking at Nora the way people look at things they expected to find broken. "You ought to know they're talking." "They were talking before I left town," Nora said. "What are they saying now?" Ruth Delaney's eyes moved past her into the kitchen. She clocked the papers on the table, the lamp burning in full daylight, the second coffee cup near the window. Her expression shifted through several calculations at once. "Morrison's telling people you've moved yourself into a man's house under false pretense, that you're using Croft to manufacture a counterclaim. He's been to see Judge Aldane twice this week." She paused. "And he's been talking to the town." "The town already has its opinion of me," Nora said. "Morrison is reinforcing something already built. That costs him less than building something new." She looked at Ruth evenly. "Thank you for coming to tell me." "I'm not certain I came to help," Ruth said, with a directness that was almost admirable. "I came because I wanted to see your face when I said it. And—" Ruth was quiet for a moment. Her expression settled into something more honest than she'd arrived with. "And you look like a woman who already knows exactly what she's doing." She turned to go, then stopped with her hand on the porch rail. "For what it's worth," Agnes Pruitt said this morning to Croft's face, in the Mercantile, in front of at least 4 people, that you are the only bookkeeper in this county who could make sense of Morrison's filings. A pause, weighted with something Ruth wasn't quite willing to call respect yet. He didn't disagree. When Elias came in that evening, the set of his jaw was different. He set his hat on the hook, stood at the basin and washed his hands, and didn't speak for long enough that Nora looked up from her work. "Morrison filed a petition," he said. "I know. Harlan heard it in town and told me this afternoon. He's claiming you're fabricating documentation to bog down his Morrison parcel claim in procedural delays." "I'm not fabricating anything," she said. "I'm using the law as it exists." He's counting on the assumption that no one will read the filings carefully enough to find the gap. She stood and crossed to the shelf where she had organized the Morrison file across 4 days of careful reconstruction. She set it on the table between them. "This is every document Morrison has filed, in order, next to every county record that contradicts it. There is a gap of 11 days in August, where his filing predates a transaction that was recorded 2 weeks earlier, a transaction that, if it had been properly cross-referenced, would have made his filing legally impossible at the time he submitted it." She looked at Elias directly. He overreached. He assumed no one he'd be up against would be organized enough to find it. Elias looked at the file. He looked at her. "He didn't know I was here," she said. Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise exactly, but the look of a man whose internal ledger just corrected itself. He picked up the file. He read the first page, then the second, reading with the focus of a man who was not educated in legal language, but was intelligent enough to follow her annotations. Then he set it down and looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been profoundly wrong about, not with embarrassment, but with the quiet gravity of genuine recalibration. "Nora," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She looked at him and waited. "I'll take this to the land office in the morning," he said. "You'll come with me." She held his gaze for 1 beat longer than the exchange required. Then she looked back at the file. "I'll have everything organized before first light." He almost said something else. She could feel the weight of it, a sentence forming behind his eyes that had nothing to do with Morrison or the land office or the morning. He picked up his hat from the table instead and walked down the hall to bed. That was the night Nora understood that she was in a different kind of trouble than the kind Morrison had made for her, and that she was not, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, looking for a way out of it. He said her name differently that time, and they both heard it. "Tell me, did you feel that shift before she did, or did you see it in him first? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one." Now, back to the story. The land office was in Hayes, 40 miles east. They left before dawn in the cold dark, breath rising in plumes in the wagon air, the horses steady on a road barely visible in the gray before first light. Elias drove. Nora sat beside him with the file in her lap and her hands in her gloves and her eyes on the horizon ahead. The silence between them had changed across 5 days from the silence of two strangers tolerating proximity into something more deliberate, the kind of quiet two people maintain because the alternative requires honesty they have not yet agreed to exchange. "At mile 20, he said, "Morrison's had dealings with Judge Aldane for 6 years. "I know that. Aldane won't be moved by a procedural filing. Aldane doesn't decide land office disputes," she said. "The county assessor does." Morrison miscalculated. He assumed you'd carry the fight to the courtroom where Aldane carries weight. The land office operates under a separate jurisdiction entirely, and the assessor has no relationship with Aldane that I have been able to find. She paused. Morrison has never had someone who understood the distinction working against him before. That's his actual problem. Elias was quiet for a mile. Then, "How do you know all of this?" She watched the prairie for a moment, the flat land catching the first pale color of sunrise at the edges, the grass silver with frost. "My father was a county clerk for 20 years. I grew up reading filings the way other children read almanacs." A pause that carried the weight of something she wasn't going to elaborate on further. "And then I married a man who made poor decisions, and I spent 2 years watching what happens when there is no one in the room, paying close enough attention to catch them in time." He didn't ask more. She didn't offer more. But something settled between them in the cold morning air, a mutual acknowledgement, unspoken, that they were both carrying histories that had been expensive, and that those histories had also made them precisely what they needed to be standing here, together, on this road. The land office clerk was a thin man named Perkins, who looked at Nora's file for 4 full minutes without speaking. He turned pages. He compared dates. He looked at Elias, who said nothing, then back at the file. "This is thorough," he said. "Yes," said Elias, "the gap in the Morrison timeline. This is a significant procedural irregularity." "Yes," said Nora. Perkins looked at her then, fully, directly, with the attention of a man reassessing. "You compiled this?" "I did." He was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. "I will need to hold this for review. 10 days, given the nature of the cross-jurisdictional elements." "That is acceptable," Nora said. "We will need a receipt of filing with the submission date stamped and witnessed." Perkins blinked, reached for his stamp, pressed it to the receipt form and handed it across the counter to her. She folded it once and placed it inside her coat. On the ride back, the sky turned the color of old pewter in the west. The wind had found a harder edge since morning. Elias watched the cloud line the way ranchers watch weather, not with fear, but with the grim arithmetic of someone calculating losses in advance. "Storm tonight," he said. "Yes. By dark, the east fence is already down." She looked at the sky, then at the land falling away to the north. "How many head do you have on the eastern quarter?" 14. Maybe 16 if Harlan moved them before we left. "Then we need to be back before it hits." He looked at her sideways. "I can ride," she said. Not a boast. Information, delivered with the same plainness she used for everything else. He pushed the horses and did not ask her to explain further. They made it back with an hour to spare. Harlan, a young man of 20, who had spent the better part of the past week finding transparent reasons to be near the kitchen when Nora was working, had moved 12 head but missed a cluster of 4 that had drifted to the northeast corner near the broken line. The wind was already carrying the first metallic edge of ice when Elias went out on horseback, and Nora, without discussion, went to the barn and saddled the second horse herself. She could ride. That had not been a boast, and it was not a surprise to her, even if it was to him. She cut east while he went north, reading the land the way she read documents, looking for the place where the pattern broke. She found the 4 strays bunched against the fence remnant and came at them from the right at a low canter, arms wide, voice low and steady, and turned them back toward the barn without noise and without panic and without once needing direction. They barred the lower barn door against the first real push of the storm and stood inside the sudden shelter of it, breathing hard, the warmth of the animals rising around them, the smell of hay and hide, and the particular close air of a place that had just been made safe. Rain began against the roof, first scattered, then solid. Harlan appeared at the far end of the barn, assessed the situation with the instinct of someone who has learned when 2 people need the room, announced he would check the water troughs, and was gone. Elias stood looking at the storm through the gap in the door. His shoulder was close to hers, close enough that she could feel the cold still coming off his coat. "You could have told me you could ride," he said. "You didn't ask." "I should have asked." "Yes," she said, "you should have. Rain on the roof, the cattle finding their places in the dark. Morrison won't sit quietly on the land office filing," he said. "No, he'll move against you directly. He's already framed you as a fraud. If he can undermine your credibility before the assessor completes the review." "He already has," she said. "The whole town already holds that verdict. There's nothing left on that front for him to take." She turned to look at Elias then. "What he does not know is that 3 days ago I filed a copy of his irregularity report with the state registry. Before he knew I had found it. Before he even knew I was out here." She paused. "If he comes at me now, he has to explain simultaneously why he submitted a pressure document with a forged lien format to a neighboring rancher, while a separate case was already in the state record under his name." Elias stared at her for a long moment. "I didn't do it for your ranch," she said. Quietly, but without apology. "I did it because he helped a corrupt clerk call me a liar in front of everyone I had ever known in this town. And I'm not a liar. I did it for myself." He said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the storm peaked, a hard driving wall of rain and wind that shook the barn door on its hinge, and then, slowly, began to ease. Inside, in the warm dark, something that had been building across 6 days arrived at its conclusion without announcement. "Nora," he said, second time. She waited. "What do you need?" he said. "To clear the deed on your homestead." "What specifically?" She hadn't expected the question. She'd been braced for almost anything else, a redirect, a practical concern, the particular deflection of a man who respects what you've done without wanting to name what it cost you. She felt the weight of being asked directly, plainly, with no performance of indifference behind it. "The clerk's original acceptance record," she said. "From 2 years ago, the filing before his connection to Morrison. If that record shows the deed accepted without any notation of irregularity, it contradicts every claim made at the hearing. It doesn't just clear my name, it shows the hearing itself was constructed. Agnes Pruitt's husband worked in that clerk's office until last spring," Elias said. "He kept duplicate copies of certain records." "Professional habit," Agnes said. "She told me this morning in the Mercantile." His voice was level. "I believe she was suggesting I pass it along to you." Nora looked at him. "I didn't mention it earlier because I wasn't certain it was still something you needed," he said. Whether the ranch was still," he stopped. The sentence had edges he wasn't willing to name yet, and he was honest enough not to dress it in something easier. "Whether you had reason to stay." The rain had softened to a murmur against the roof. "It matters," she said. "The record matters. The reason to stay matters." He nodded once, turned back toward the barn door. "In the morning, then." She reached out and put her hand on his arm. She had not decided to do it. It stopped him the way a spoken word would not have. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, the way a man looks at something he's been careful not to look at for longer than he should have. "I told the truth in that courthouse," she said, "every word of it, and they called me a liar in front of every person I had known for 4 years. She held his gaze and did not waver. "You are the first person who treated my word as evidence rather than petition." The muscle along his jaw moved. He lifted his hand and placed it over hers, not pulling, not pressing, just the steady weight of his palm over her fingers, warm and certain and deliberately placed. "Then I'm calling you honest," he said, "in front of anyone who asks, any time they ask it." She did not look away. "That's enough," she said. "That is exactly enough." They stood another moment in the barn door with the storm unwinding itself across the prairie, neither of them moving toward anything more and neither of them retreating. Two people who had spent years in their separate silences, standing at the edge of something that did not need a name yet, only the willingness to remain. Agnes Pruitt's husband found the original acceptance record the next morning in a storage box he had kept out of professional conscience, and the particular stubbornness of a man who believes records matter, even when no one else is looking. Nora wrote the accompanying letter to the county office in language precise enough to be unanswerable. Elias signed it as witness. The clerk who had called her a liar submitted his resignation 11 days later, citing personal reasons the town of Caldwell accepted with a silence that amounted to agreement. Morrison's claim on the eastern fence line was dismissed on procedural grounds 2 weeks after the land office review concluded. He did not appeal. Nora believed he had found the state registry filing and decided that continuing cost more than the land was worth. She did not say this aloud. She noted it in her own ledger in the column she kept for outcomes and moved on. Ruth Delaney told Agnes Pruitt she'd been wrong about Nora Vance. Agnes told 4 people before noon. It reached 12 people by supper. It was not an apology from the town. It was Caldwell's version of one, and Nora had learned enough about this place to understand the difference and accept it for what it was. The homestead deed was cleared on a Thursday. The air was cold and sharp, the sky washed clean by the week's weather, the light coming off the land at a low angle that made everything look more permanent than it had in weeks. Nora stood on the step of the county land office with the stamped document in her hands, and was quiet for a long moment, not from grief, not from relief, but from the particular stillness of a person who has carried something heavy for a very long time, and has just set it down and is not yet accustomed to the absence of the weight. Elias stood beside her. He had driven her. He had not offered to wait outside, or suggested she was capable of handling it without him. He had simply come, and she had not asked him to, and neither of them had remarked on the arrangement. "You could sell it," he said. She looked at the deed. "I could. Or you could lease it and remain on at the ranch." He said it the way he said things that mattered, looking forward, voice flat and even, as if the words required nothing of him when she could read, clearly by now, exactly what they required. The accounts need permanent attention. Harlan needs oversight before he moves cattle somewhere irretrievable. "And he stopped, then started again, choosing the plain version. "I need someone who reads a contract the way you read one." She looked at him. "I need you," he said. Simple, irrevocable, wearing no disguise. She folded the deed and placed it in her coat pocket beside everything else she had carried through this fall. She turned to face him fully in the flat October light on the step of the building that had just returned her name to her. "Then I'll stay," she said. He offered his hand. Not as a formality, not to seal something transactional. Just offered. The way a man opens a door he is not sure will be accepted, and does it anyway because the alternative is not something he is willing to choose. She took it, held it, felt his fingers close around hers with the deliberateness of a decision rather than a reflex. "Nora," he said. 3rd time, softest of the 3. The street of Caldwell moved around them, a wagon passing, a woman stepping out of the dry goods with a wrapped parcel, 2 men talking at the corner who glanced over and looked away. A woman who had been called a liar, standing in plain daylight, holding the hand of a man who had decided her word was worth more than the town's verdict, and who had said so, and who was not taking it back. That was all. That was everything. She proved that the truth is not made smaller by the number of people who refuse to hear it. He chose, with both hands and clear eyes, to stand beside a woman the town had already condemned, and he did not make a speech of it. He just stayed. "Tell me, would you have trusted her word before the records came through, or did you need the proof first? Leave your answer below. Next week, a woman named Willa steps off a stage in Broken Creek carrying a carpet bag and a land grant with a name on it no one in that town will say out loud. Her story begins before she reaches the door. Subscribe now so you are there when it opens.